from the blackest corners of your mind, they call, pulling you deep into shadow, twisting your senses, keeping you from sleep. It's time to face your darkest fears. This is Tales to Terrify. Good evening, children of the night, and welcome to part 1 of our 500th episode. I hope you've grabbed your snacks and refreshments and are tucked in safe and sound under the covers, because our episode this evening comes in at almost 2.5 times the length of a normal show, and it packs some serious chills. This week we're joined by a handful of very special guests. Voices that, if you've been dabbling in horror podcasting for literally any amount of time, will no doubt be hauntingly familiar. One of the things I love most about the horror community, both podcasting and writing, is the camaraderie. Just as fear comes in a near infinite variety of flavors and forms, so too do the stories and storytellers that invoke it. And we all just seem to band together in it, too. It's our shared love of the terrible and the unsettling. The raw connection, maybe, of our own human frailty and mortality that draws us all to the same gruesome place. And I love that we can gather like this. I am so excited to have some true legends of the horror podcasting community to join us for this milestone this evening. And without wasting any more time, I think it's time for us to dive right in. Our first story for the evening comes from Keith O'Neill. Keith O'Neill is professor of English at Duchess Community College, where he teaches literature and creative writing. His work has been published in McSweeney's Internet Tendency, Andromeda Spaceways magazine, and Bewildering Tales. He lives in Poughkeepsie, New York. Children of the night, join me for Keith O'Neill's Rise Up in the Falling Rain, a Tales to Terrify original.
Before the whole world went crazy, they hung a new set of traffic lights up at the entrance to my neighborhood, across from the gas station that later was on fire for 3 weeks. Because they never took the lights out of their black plastic wrappers, it looks like 3 body bags have been strung up over the county highway. Tonight, I wish those lights were unwrapped and switched on. I'm running late, and I can't stand getting to a movie after it's started. I guess traffic lights become a low priority in a world in which it's normal for gas stations to burn for almost the entire month of June. I've got about 35 minutes, and the theater is only 10 minutes away, but traffic isn't exactly predictable these days. Plus, I've got to give Deb, my girlfriend, plenty of time to shamble from her house to my car. I note, with some interest, sitting at the end of my road and waiting for a small convoy of military vehicles to go by, that someone appears to have moved into the shell of the burned-out gas station. A couple have set up a makeshift shelter in the ruined car bay. It's hard to tell between amphibious vehicles and Humvees roaring past, but it looks like the woman is actually pregnant. I tell myself that the whole thing is a travesty of the Advent, a hot August standing in for December, a hydraulic lift for a manger, a melted red Texaco logo for the North Star, a Monster Mary and Monster Joseph completing the joke. I already know that Deb will tell me to take this little domestic scene as a good sign, that things are getting better, so I plan on keeping it to myself. Then I tell myself that woman's abdomen is probably just distended. Corpses can't make babies. Whenever I get going about how things are really breaking down society-wise, that things are getting worse, Deb always reminds me to watch my preconceived notions. Bigotry, she calls it. Lifeism, instilled in all of us from years and years of propaganda against the living dead. I chose the word shamble earlier on purpose. It's the perfect description of what Deb does when she goes anywhere. She shambles. When she walks, her legs drag along the ground and make a creepy slide thump sound. Once the convoy passes, the roads are pretty clear tonight. Usually I can count on some kind of wreck blocking the way, or maybe just a jam because somebody's wandered mindlessly out into the middle of the road. All I see now is a truck on its side in a parking lot, and what looks like some looting going on at the old radio shack. But thanks to the convoy, nothing that slows me down. I've seen so many things in the past 3 months that I would have once considered horrifying or sickening. It's amazing how quickly we can adjust. Pretty much the only thing that scares me these days is the cemetery. The irony is not lost on me. Now that the dead walk the earth and are part of all our lives again, graveyards have lost most of their mystery for the living. Yet I'll take the long way around town to avoid it at all costs. When I get to her place, Deb's already in the front yard, staring at nothing and scaring all the kids on the block. Her skin is the color of cement, and her hair looks like strands of seaweed draped over her skull. I roll down my window. "Deb, what are you doing?" "Oh," she says, and I can tell this is going to be one of those nights. "What?" I leave the car running and come around to guide her to the passenger door. "Deb, please don't tell me your vocal cords are gone." I bend her at the waist and guide her into the car. Even with the seat pushed all the way back, it's a little hard to get her legs in. I'm afraid to fold them because they might snap off. I saw that happen to an old lady at work a couple of weeks ago. She tried sitting in one of the plastic waiting chairs and snap. There she was in two. Her legs doing scissor kicks on the linoleum and her upper torso vertical in the molded seat, screaming that she was going to sue the government. I close the door for Deb and then run around the back of the car to my side. I see Deb's parents in the window looking through the blinds, but when I wave, they close them quickly. They're in total denial about Deb's condition. It's a phase, they say, and they can't stand me because they think that I had something to do with her becoming a zombie. She was already dead when I met her, I once reminded them. Her father muttered something about hipsters. Once she's settled in and I'm navigating the ruined roads to the Cineplex, Deb finally talks to me. "I was this close to getting the Hendersons' cat." She holds up a stiff hand as if to show me a small distance between her thumb and forefinger, but she lost that kind of dexterity in her hands a long time ago. It's okay, though. I know what she means. "Don't you think the Hendersons would mind you eating their cat?" She turns to look at me, which means twisting her whole stiff upper torso. "Do you think I care what those drunks think? They're off on one of their booze cruises without even leaving a bowl of food out for the poor thing. It's so neglected that it's practically feral. It'd be better off dead. A mercy killing, if you ask me." I tell myself she's kidding, goading me. I know better than to get into the sticky ethics of animal rights versus zombie rights. So I'm actually glad to see a traffic jam on the arterial. I let the smoke and flashing lights of emergency vehicles derail our conversation. "What now? We won't make the movie at this rate. Looks like a demonstration." Sure enough, as we get closer, I see a burning car and what looks like a human leg in the middle of the road. There are a couple dozen zombies standing around, some right in front of traffic. One of them has blood all over her chin and down the front of her dress. Deb scans the crowd to see if there's anyone she knows as we slowly make it into the one lane left open. I consider making a remark about rubbernecking, but then rethink it, since Deb's neck isn't exactly flexible. I've become very sensitive to my language since we started dating. There are even more zombies around the next intersection. They've filled up all of Chestnut Street. Looks like things got out of hand. There must have been some kind of attack. It's a demonstration. That's a mob, Deb. I wouldn't want to be out there in the middle of it. It's a demonstration. They're protesting. Protesting what? We drive slowly past an upside-down ambulance, its rear windows completely covered in blood. I want to ask Deb how the ambulance is not just on its side, but completely turned over, but I bite my tongue. It occurs to me that bite my tongue might also be an offensive phrase. Looks to me like a party. How can two people sit next to each other and see two completely different things? Deb sees activism, and I see, well, a scene from a horror movie. Are your teeth chattering? We roll past a man in tattered clothes who growls in my window. No, I'm just cold. It's August. You would think that being in a relationship with a zombie would be a rather frosty experience, but I can attest that this isn't the case at all. In fact, I do think the issue of emotional distance is one of our biggest problems, but the fault is all mine. I'm much more shut down than Deb is. She calls me Fester because she says I stew in my own thoughts without sharing. We've only been dating for a couple of weeks, but when I look into Deb's dull gray eyes, I can feel this incredible pull from her. She wants me not just today, but for what she calls the long haul. She can sit and just talk and talk and talk, for days at a time if she wanted, about our feelings for each other. And though I think I'm a pretty agreeable sort, telling anyone my every feeling makes me even more uncomfortable than cruising through a mob of zombies. There's Jerry. She's pointing to a zombie trying to open the back door of a school bus that's half off the road. There's something else bothering me tonight, but I'm not going to bring it up with Deb. More and more lately, my mind keeps going back to Cynthia, my wife. We met in college and got married the summer after we graduated. At first, things were perfect. With a little help from her parents, we bought a house, the one I still live in. And we got jobs, 2 new cars, bills, the whole deal. We talked about having kids when we had saved a little more money, and we were happy for a while. But then, I don't know what happened. It was like the life just fell out of the relationship. At this point, I can just hear Deb yelling at me to watch my biases. The life being sucked out of someone is not necessarily a bad thing, she'd say. Anyway, Cynthia and I started fighting a lot about everything. Fighting without a point, over petty stuff. At other times, we barely talked. We'd eat in front of the TV and watch our shows and then go to bed, and that was about it. We forgot about having kids completely until the day Cynthia announced that she was late. The home tests didn't come up positive, to our mutual relief, I guess. But after another month, Cynthia was still late and decided to go to the doctor. She wasn't pregnant, but they did find something growing in her. The cancer was throughout her uterus and ovaries, and, worst of all, spotting her liver. Cynthia, who was rarely ill, rarely even unwell, was suddenly given 6 months to live. After that, it was chemo and radiation nearly every day. And once they started digging around in her, she was never the same. She started losing weight around the same time I started gaining. I was very practical back then. I didn't believe in anything without absolute proof. Since I never really saw the cancer or any signs that Sin was sick at all before that, I became convinced that it was the doctors that were killing her. Of course, I understood intellectually that there was something serious and terrible happening to my wife's cells, but in terms of really believing it, you might as well have told me that within a few months the dead would rise again and walk the earth. You see, I guess, how the times can change a person. The doctors may not have been lying about the cancer, but they got at least one thing wrong. Sin died within 3 months of getting the news, instead of 6. She was so weak that she didn't really know what was happening, so we never really got to resolve anything before she went. Between her painkillers and the weight I'd gained, I don't even know if she knew who I was in the end. A lot of zombie movies are social commentaries of one kind or another. The country's problems with race, the country's problem with capitalism, the country's problems with zombies. I just never expected that zombies themselves would be such big social commentators. Every zombie I know has got an opinion. They're very cerebral. I don't think a lot of people realize that. It must have something to do with their bodies shutting down. Maybe that's why in all those movies you have to shoot them in the brain. They think too much. After they've made the switch, they don't have a lot to worry about. Eating the fresh and warm flesh of the living and deliberating on what society needs to do to be better. That's it. The movie we're seeing tonight? A zombie flick. It wasn't my choice. Sometimes I just want to get away from the topic for a while. But Deb wants everything out on the table at all times. Just like my therapist, who also happens to be a zombie. I think Deb enjoys critiquing the inaccuracies on the screen. On the way home, I suggest that we try seeing a normal movie next time. A romantic comedy or something. Define normal. Deb gives me, and I really mean this, a cold stare. A beetle trundles across her upper lip and slips behind her ear. You know what I mean. Yes, I think I do. I try to explain. Look, I'm just saying, if you know you're going to be offended, then why do we go to these things? I don't really have a choice, do I? Do you know any movies actually made by my people yet? It's always the living's representation of the dead. I don't know. Romero had some sympathetic moments for zombies. Romero? He's the worst. He's like D.W. Griffith to my kind, and Night of the Living Dead is like Birth of a Nation for my people. I tell her that she's exaggerating, but to myself, I think she might have a point there. We're not idiots, you know, she says, attempting to roll her eyes. The media loves to portray us as mindless, but did you ever stop to think about how biased the mainstream media is against the living dead? Not just us. Vampires, werewolves, ghosts, whatever. I drive for a minute to let that sink in. Wait a minute. There are werewolves now, too? So here's what's really been bothering me. If Deb is still up and around, though technically dead, what about Cynthia? I mean, I buried Sin, or what was left of her after the chemo, a short time before the first zombie showed up. Or went public, as Deb puts it. So where does that leave Sin? Sometimes I lie in bed and think about her grave, really think about it. And I think about Sin being 6 feet below the azalea bush I planted for her. And I can imagine her scratching at the lid of her overpriced coffin. I think about the weight she lost in the harrowing last weeks of her life. And I think about that terrible wig they buried her in. But mostly I just think about the sound of her nails once they started scratching through the fake satin lining of her coffin. The next day is not a good one at work at all. Truthfully, there hasn't been a good day at work since people started coming back. Counseling at the Social Security Administration has never been a walk in the park, but now our entire system is wrecked. It's the little things that people never thought of in those old zombie movies. Like the fact that people would be coming back from the grave not only looking for flesh, they're looking for handouts as well. The undead are very dependent on public assistance. Deb claims that they're all collectivists, but I think they're generally the biggest bunch of freeloaders I've ever met. Not one of them contributes to society or pays taxes, and yet I have to deal every day with a line of rotting, angry ghouls who are outraged that their social security number has been retired or even reused. And we're not the only ones. The police are backlogged for months, processing reports from the undead on their own murders. The courts are clogged with civil suits trying to deal with the still unsolved problem of zombies trying to declare their executed wills null and retrieving their estates. When I suggest to Deb that this doesn't sound very collectivist, she tells me those are a vocal minority. Just because you're dead doesn't mean you stop being an asshole, she says. Even the churches are overflowing, a phenomenon I've never understood. You'd think having molded in the ground for some time without passing on to another realm would shake the foundation of one's beliefs, but old habits die hard. Says Deb, nothing dies, and did you ever think that Jesus, risen from the grave, might have been some kind of zombie? Did you? Just about the only profession not inundated of late, for obvious reasons I guess, is medicine. Fatalities are a thing of the past now, or at least fatalities as we once knew them. The result of all this? That much of the time, even the most bone-chilling things quickly become reduced to the mundane. Every day is a reminder that what might be a crisis just might be another boring change. All of this adds up to the fact that things with Deb aren't going well at all. After the movie, we did what we usually do. We parked the car outside her parents' house and talked. The lights were off in the house, but I knew her parents were awake in there, watching us fearfully from darkened windows. Deb tried to start the conversation again, the one in which she attempts to convince me to convert, to switch over to the zombie side. What exactly are you so scared of? I'm not sure. Are you afraid it will hurt? Yes, sort of. The truth is, I wasn't thinking about converting at all. I was thinking of Cynthia again, but I couldn't say that. I haven't actually told Deb about my thoughts about Sin's grave. I've never seen her act jealous, but I don't know what her reaction will be. I'll admit that I'm more than a little scared. So I sat there having a kind of double conversation. One out loud with Deb about the pros and cons of becoming a zombie, and one silently to myself about Cynthia being alive or not. I won't bite much, she said flirtatiously. It was finally starting to cool down. The breeze helped with the smell in the car. After a while, I said, It isn't that. I just think that death can serve as a kind of closure sometimes. Well, that would be convenient, wouldn't it? She scratched her yellow nail on the vinyl of the car, lost in zombie thought. I didn't know what to say. All I could think of was how it's all so confusing these days. Like the past and the present have piled up on each other like a car wreck. When are you going to let go? Of what? I don't have it as easy as you know. I'm not complete. Every day changes for me. What I didn't mention was that I'm afraid that I've gone from thinking of myself as a widower to some kind of kidnapper, a man who keeps his wife hostage in a little box under the ground, the address my dark little secret. I admit, maybe because I'm having this dual conversation, that I may have screwed up a bit with Deb. What's that supposed to mean? You don't have as many needs, do you? I was digging my hole deeper. You're settled in a way that I can't be. So, now I'm empty. Is that what you're saying? Nice. She twisted her lips into a snarl, and her face took on this greenish hue that she gets when she's really upset. Until you're in my position, I think you'd be wise not to assume you know what goes on in me. Then she started the protracted process of getting herself out of the car without my help. I imagined her parents watching us argue from behind pulled shades, and I sat there fuming. So, as I said, today is a rough one at the office. There's an incident in the lobby between an agent and a client that escalates too quickly to be contained. In other words, an argument starts, words are exchanged, and it ends in a bloodbath. By the time we get down there, it's too late. One of our best auditors is bitten. When I make it out from behind the bulletproof partition, I see Ted, whom I've known for years, standing there with his ear and part of his neck torn off. He's lost so much blood from the wound that it's too late to get any help. He's already gone.
"I quit,"
says the newly undead Ted.
"Hey, he had it coming to him,"
says the biter. As it turns out, Ted was in fact in the wrong. In the heat of the argument, he called the client a monster. And of course, we have no tolerance for language like that in the Social Security Administration. Ted eventually shambled away, and I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince the client not to sue for discrimination. No matter what happens, I'm going to have to hand in a hell of an incident report. During all of this, I've resigned myself to just going home and spending the night watching the emergency news network behind barricaded windows and doors, blasting the air conditioning, and hoping that the power stays on through the night. So I'm surprised to get a call from Deb late in the afternoon telling me to come over right after work. She's waiting for me in her front yard as usual, but she's got a cooler and shovel with her. Once I get her situated in her seat, I say, "Look, I was completely wrong last night. Just drive. Make a left on the county road. Where are we going?" But I know what's in that direction, of course. Deb directs me to the graveyard, Sin's graveyard, and she even knows where my wife is buried. The afternoon humidity is relentless, and my shirt is drenched with sweat before we get there. The car smells like a chattel house. "How did you know? What you've been so distracted by lately? Give me some credit. I might be capable of some surprises after all." We park, and I grab the cooler from the back seat and open it to find 2 six-packs of the cold stuff. It's a mutual interest we share, if for different reasons. I like beer because it tastes good and gets me drunk. Deb likes beer because she can feel the bubbles run through her gut. "So, what are we doing here?" She pulls the shovel stiffly from the back seat of my car. "Well, you are going to confront your fears." "I am?" "You are. You're going to dig Cynthia's coffin up, let her out, and, if she's capable of it, talk to her." I am?" "You are." I finish my beer in one gulp and open another. "Look, Deb." "Look nothing, mister. Everything you've told me about Cynthia tells me that it was over with you two, or at least it was going to be over. There's nothing wrong with that. You move on, but you've been using her death as an excuse to not let go." A raven lands on a nearby tombstone, and I shoo it away by throwing one of the empties at it. "Nevermore," I joke. "For all your talk of closure, you haven't had any. Death has been a crutch for you, an excuse not to admit the marriage failed. Losing your wife to cancer was easier than losing her because you didn't love each other." Fucking zombie logic. It's airtight. And what about us? I open a beer for Deb and hand it to her. She sips some, but a lot of it runs down her face. It's adorable. "I have no doubts about us. I'm not so insecure to think that having your ex around will be a threat. If it is, we deal with it, but no more quarantining the past." "She's not my ex yet." "Whatever. I don't need a piece of paper to tell me who I love or who loves me. The old ways are changing, in case you haven't noticed. You see it every day at work." "I see a lot of bad stuff at work. There's going to be trouble with every great change, but you've got to take the long view here." The sun is like a bare bulb in the sky. Directly behind it, according to astronomers, sits the center of the Milky Way. To the east, some clouds have appeared on the horizon. They're too dark and complicated to offer any simple hope of shade. I'm sorry I called you empty. You didn't, actually. You just implied it. But you are forgiven in any case. So, do you want to start digging soon, or what? Sure. But will you do me a favor first? Anything. Come here. I think of a line from the all-zombie version of Hamlet we saw a couple of weeks back. Hold off the earth a while till I have caught her in my arms once more. We drank the rest of the beer on Cynthia's grave, lining the empties neatly around the azalea bush. The August sun dips down beneath the trees, and those clouds deliver actually on their threat. It starts to rain in big warm drops that explode when they hit the ground. Soon it's pouring, but at least the heat from the afternoon is finally gone. Deb looks like a melted candle. I pick up the shovel and start the hard work of exhumation. Ready? Ready. Deb, with a gray smile, stands behind me with a cold embrace. As the shovel breaks the muddy ground of Cynthia's grave, I feel Deb's teeth break the skin on my neck. Each of us, in our own way, mining for richer veins within.
That was Keith O'Neill's Rise Up in the Falling Rain, as read by the No Sleep podcast's very own David Cummings. David Cummings is a voice actor and podcaster born and raised in Toronto, Canada. In 2011, David rekindled his love of voice acting and audio horror storytelling by launching the No Sleep podcast. For more than 7 years now, it has been David's full-time job. He and his team of talented collaborators strive to create an immersive and unsettling audio horror experience each week. The podcast recently celebrated its 10th anniversary and is in its 16th season. The opportunity to voice act on many projects has been one of the highlights of his career, having performed not only on No Sleep, but also Darkest Night, Deadly Manners, The Black Tapes, Pseudopod, and, of course, Tales to Terrify. David currently splits his time between Toronto and New Jersey with his wife, Kelly. Personally, I've been listening to No Sleep since about episode 7, way back when. And I have to give a huge shout out to David for being one of the biggest inspirations that got me to take the leap into audio horror as well. Thank you so much, David, for joining us for this special occasion. Our second tale tonight comes from a long-time Tales to Terrify contributor, Rick Kennett. I just took a look back at our archives, and this will be Rick's 9th time on the show. Rick is a lifelong resident of Melbourne, Australia, where he works in the transport industry and has an interest in cemeteries, ghosts, and all things spooky. He is the author of 5 novels and collections, and is the co-author of 472 Cheyne Walk, a continuation of the adventures of William Hope Hodgson's Carnacki the Ghost Finder. Though a whippet and cat owner for 25 years, he is now content to merely talk to next door's White Tom, who sometimes deigns to respond. Listen with me, children of the night, to Rick Kennett's The Outsider, first published in Ghosts and Scholars 14, 1992, and again in Year's Best Horror 21, 1993.
When the Earl of Woodthorpe cut down a gum tree in his manor grounds and air freighted it out to Australia, most people assumed his mind had thrown a rod. I knew otherwise. I'd always thought of doing the rounds of the haunts of England, so when the Antarctic winds of June hit town, I decided to do more than just think about it. Stowing my bike in cold storage, I packed a few necessities like the Gazetteer of British Ghosts, Poltergeists over England, Haunted Britain and such like items, along with a few clothes, before grabbing the first big silver bird heading north into summer. I landed on my feet in London by finding a rent-a-bike place that had me powering up the A40 motorway towards Buckinghamshire on a 750 Norton that afternoon. Over the following week I toured sites of supernatural interest, hotels, cottages, stately homes, wishing wells. My camera clicked like a mad cicada, though never once getting a phantom in the viewfinder. Undeterred, I continued my tour, and somewhere between Devon and Dorset, I ran into the Earl of Woodthorpe at about 90 kilometres per hour. It was 7 o'clock on a straight road. The sun was low in the west, and suddenly there was this long silver car pulling out from a gateway to my right. No time for brakes, to throttle back, to even have an articulate thought. The car's bumper smacked my front wheel. The world twisted into a blur as the Norton and I went sprawling. Shock's a crazy place. Somewhere in its shattered time sense, a middle-aged woman said, "I'll fetch a blanket," as I lay bundled on a couch, shivering. I swear I didn't see him, my lord," said a younger man's voice as I lay face down on the road. The smell of leather upholstery, the sound of tyres, the feeling of movement, and somewhere in all of this the woman kept fluttering about, sounding apologetic, feeding me broth. "Best call Dr. Rutherford, Mrs. Winton," said a tall bloke with an aristocratic look. "Nah, just let me rest," I heard myself say. Nothing was broken or missing, and I hate fuss, especially when I'm dying, or think I am. I remembered being partly ushered, partly led, partly helped along corridors lined with paintings, and up an oak staircase as a clock somewhere chimed the hour. I woke up in a bed the likes of which I'd only seen in period costume movies. The room, with its panelled walls, ornate ceiling and heavy furniture of another time, had a beautiful view over the morning. Whoever owned this place had a backyard that wouldn't stop. It was all lawns and trees and hedgerows, stone outbuildings, ponds, paths, hillocks and dips. A knock on the door. A voice I'd heard before. "Breakfast, Mr. Payne." Having already dressed, I opened the door to allow the broth pusher of the night before, Mrs. Winton, to enter with a clatter of cup, saucer and tray, and with the welcome smell of bacon and eggs. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning, sir. How have you mended?" "I'll survive. Look, sorry if I asked this last night, but, exactly where am I?" "Woodthorpe Manor, sir. The country estate of the 17th Earl of Woodthorpe." She placed the tray on the table by the window with practised neatness. "I hope you like orange juice." "Ah, yes, thank you. Is his earlship about at the moment?" "His lordship," Mrs. Winton replied without emphasis, "left for the continent last night. He asked me to pass on his most sincere apologies once again, and to assure you that all expenses in respect of your motorcycle will be met." I fumbled a chair out from the window table, feeling awkward under her eyes. "Where's the bike now?" "Keenan, the head gardener, has taken it to the village garage, Scudamores. They'll have it mended in a couple of days, sir." She hesitated, then added, "Until then you may stay here as his lordship's guest." I was going to say, "That's nice of him," but instead I said, "Are my bags here?" "Still downstairs, sir. I'm afraid the one containing your books burst in the accident." "Hey?" "Nothing to worry about, sir. Duncan, his lordship's chauffeur, picked them all up." "Good old Duncan," I muttered. I started in on my eggs, but barely had the yolk running when I felt her eyes again. I looked up and Mrs. Winton cleared her throat. "Pardon me for asking, sir, but are you Australian?" "Guilty. What gave me away? My accent or the jars of Vegemite in my other bag?" Mrs. Winton said nothing, only stood there as if wanting to say more, but not knowing how to start. I already felt out of place here, and this wasn't helping. I tapped the cosy on the teapot. "Sit yourself down and pour yourself a cuppa. I won't tell his earlship." I was half surprised when she did take the seat opposite, and totally surprised me when she said, "Are you a physical researcher?" I stared at her for a good 5 seconds, then remembered she'd seen my books. "Well, I have done what I like to call ghost hunting in the past, but is that why you've come to England?" She said it as if I'd come to extradite some fugitive Antipodean apparition. I said, "Not exactly. I'm just doing this spooky tour of England, the places I've only read about. Borley, Clouds Hill, Raynham Hall, 50 Berkeley Square, places like that. I'm interested in the supernatural, but no more ghost hunting. I found out the hard way that the occult is too unpleasant at close quarters." "But it must be a real experience to hunt a ghost." "It is. That is, if that's what you call trying to shove a cranky water elemental into a crystal geode, or facing up to a demon with all your runes round the wrong way, or nearly being strangled by a book illustration. No more ghost hunting for me, Mrs. Winton. Not even if you threaten me with money. From now on, I'm strictly a tourist." "Oh. You sound disappointed. Do you have a ghost in the house?" I got ready to run in case she said yes. "There are no ghosts under his lordship's roof, sir, and that's the plain and simple truth. It may make us look a bit out of step, what with every manor and lodge hereabouts sporting a haunted bedroom or a ghost's gallery, some of which I dare say are trumped up for the tourist pound. Not that I'm a scoffer, sir. I've been in service since I was a lass, and know a lot more than most about the quality homes, and I can tell you, sir, that some of the best have things walking in them that aren't right things, if you follow my meaning. Now, if you'll excuse me, sir, I'd best be about my duties. Even with the family away, there's still a lot to be done." Mrs. Winton left me then, to my own memories of things that walked that weren't right things. It really spoilt my breakfast. I got lost trying to find the front door. There was a north wing and a south wing, an east front and a west front. There were wide corridors of thick carpet and polished oak panelling, and a long gallery of ancestral portraits that glared after me as I tiptoed past. Once through the massive columns of the east front, I struck out on the first path I found, letting it take me where it would. At first it wound its way through the trees scattered about the southeast lawn, at one point passing a scraggy palm, looking decidedly unimpressed by the English climate. On the side of a hillock was a square of trees that looked very familiar. I'm no treologist, but these looked like fair dinkum Aussie gums. The smooth, light grey, dark grey spotted bark, the eucalyptus tang of the leaves, the little plaque saying Australian gum. The path sloped, then forked further along. The left-hand path led me to a lawn surrounding a marble structure I could only think of as a summer house with delusions of grandeur. Open-sided, circular and gleaming white, its steps splaying out from 3 openings in its half walls, mock Grecian columns, scrolled and fluted, supporting a domed roof. Chiselled over one of the openings was "The Second Pavilion," below that Anno Domini 1827. There were stone seats running along the inside wall and a circular slab raised at its centre. Nothing I didn't expect, except there was this arrow scratched into the stonework between 2 of the columns. It was pointing to nothing but the tops of distant trees somewhere in the lower part of the grounds. I started walking in that direction. I'd no idea what I might be walking to, but it gave me some time to think. Here I was in the proverbial English country garden. To my left were outbuildings I took to be stables or garages, and the glittering glass of a greenhouse where the Earl probably grew his prize-winning marrows. To my right were ponds and grass and trees, what amounted to a private wood. Private. The word made me pause to wonder, not exactly for the first time, what was I doing here? Of course, the Earl felt responsible for the accident and all, but I put myself in his place. A grand ancient home crammed with paintings, silverware, jewellery, antiques, history. And into this he allows not only a stranger, but a colonial of dubious social standing. Wouldn't it have been safer, as far as the Earl was concerned, to simply put me up at the nearest hotel until the bike was fixed? Something wasn't quite kosher here. In fact, the more I thought on it, the more that uncomfortable out-of-place feeling increased. It was a maze. I somehow knew this even before I reached the ivy-crept stone wall. Possibly it was the wrought-iron gate and the roofless walls I could see beyond it. The gate looked like it hadn't been opened in years, and in fact there were rust marks showing it had been chained shut until very recently. But when I pushed the gate, it opened with a shiver and a screech, so I edged in. The walls were all weather-stained and mossy, in some places even cracked and pitted. It was cold, quiet too. So quiet that I found myself stepping softly to lessen the echo of all my footsteps in the stone-paved alleys. Every now and then I stopped to scrape dirt into piles against the walls, as markers. The alley I followed had begun to fork and twist fantastically, and the prospect of getting lost had become real, perhaps even dangerous. Sometimes the path crossed another, making me wonder if I wasn't going round and round and round. Further in, the alleys widened occasionally into little gardens, all dead from long neglect, oblongs of dust and empty flower beds. And every time I found one, I found more of the same coldness and a sense of sadness that the sun, sitting on the east-facing walls, couldn't burn away. All I could see of the world was the sky holding one small cloud. It was just enough to show me that I was spiralling in towards the centre. So I pushed on, now noticing a slight downwardness as I passed other oblong boxes of once-was gardens and the craters of dry pools with dry ruts leading in and out. Small statues stood guard at random places, and there was even the occasional stone bench. It was while passing one of these that I thought I heard slow footsteps in the next alley. I stood up on the bench, but the wall was still too high, so I yelled, "Hello? Is anybody there?" For a long time I listened for an answer, hearing nothing, yet sure there was someone or something behind that wall. The silence grew, and I was wishing now I hadn't called out. Then a wind leapt up with an almost human cry, stinging my face and hands with dirt. Something winked across the sun and was gone, leaving silence again, and an odd impression of dry heat and vast distances that passed just as quickly as it had come. The alley was still, and for a long time I sat on the bench, wondering if it mightn't be wiser to search my way out. No, I'd come too far to turn back just because a bird had startled me. And the wind, freak gust. So I told myself, and so I continued on. The alleys were still cold, but had less shadow in them by the time I saw treetops looming over the walls ahead. Not long after that I hit a path running beside a curving wall that these trees grew behind. I guessed they were the trees I'd seen from the second pavilion, but this curving wall, this inner circle, was beyond guessing. Following it round, I came to a gate. This was not like the one at the entrance. The inner gate was big, solid, and sported a padlock perhaps a century old or more. It was as good as any keep out sign, Above the gate was a piece of stonework that had the look of being tacked on as an afterthought. On it was carved Retine quod aqua coercitur. It was all Greek to me, or rather Latin, though the third word obviously was water. I'd noted them down on a parking ticket I'd got in Oxfordshire, then set off following the rest of the wall. It took me a few minutes to get back to the gate. I'd found only that one gate in my circuit of the wall, though at one point I thought I heard something like tinkling bells coming from somewhere inside the circle. By now I was beginning to feel hungry and more than a little thirsty. Great Britain isn't known for its deaths by dehydration. Not wanting to start a trend, I tried to recall the paths that had led me in. There was no pattern to the maze, no every third gap on the left continues the path sort of thing. I just had to do my best in following memory and my little markers of heaped up dirt. Between them, I wound up in more dead ends than there are in any two cemeteries. But I persevered, and what with finding dirty marks that I hoped were my earlier footprints, I eventually worked my way out. There was a small truck in the drive by the steps of the east front. There was an oil stain and a piece of mirror among the plant cuttings and soil in its tray. Keenan the gardener, I presumed, had returned from taking the Norton to the garage. I slunk in through the great marble columns, half expecting to be turfed out by some snotty-nosed butler. I was coming down with bad doses of class consciousness and culture shock, an easy frame of mind to fall into with these imposing surroundings. So, gathering all my nerve, I pushed open the door and strode in as if I owned the place. Truth to tell, I felt less like Lord Ernie than Ernie Pine, lower-class interloper, and I couldn't help looking around to make sure no one saw me. There was no one in sight, but muffled voices raised as if in argument were coming from behind the grand staircase. A grey-haired man wearing a bib and brace stood in the doorway of what I supposed was the housekeeper's under-the-stairs office. He was almost back to me, and as I approached I recognised Mrs. Winton's voice coming from within. "But he's a gift." "But he ain't black," said the man, "and any road, if his lordship—" "Who ain't black?" I asked. The man turned sharply and for several seconds just stared at me as though I'd committed some unforgivable social blunder. Mrs. Winton leaned out through the door and smiled. "Mr. Pine, we were beginning to wonder if you'd lost yourself in the maze. You wouldn't be the first." "I, not the first?" echoed the old man, looking away. I muttered something about it being formidable, though there were other adjectives that came to mind more readily. Weird, for instance. I was introduced to the grey-haired man, the Manor's head gardener, Keenan. "Keenan, sir, just Keenan." "About the bike," I said. "Took your machine into town first thing I did," said Keenan, "and Scudamore's workshop, they be onto it promptly." "Meanwhile, Mr. Pine is welcome to stay here," said Mrs. Winton. "Are you sure?" I said. Mrs. Winton fluttered her hands. "Think no more of it. It's only right that we should put you up while you're off the road. Isn't that so, Keenan?" But before he could answer, she continued, "And you won't be the only stranger at the manor soon, as there'll be outside contractors coming in tomorrow to see to the grounds. Now, sir, what did you think of our maze?" "A quiet place, isn't it?" I said, trying to think of something nice to say about it. "Why is the centre closed? What's in there?" Keenan and Mrs. Winton glanced at each other like parents desperately trying to put off explaining the facts of life to their pregnant daughter. "Well, it was built like that," said Keenan lamely at last. "The inner gate was locked, and probably had been for a long time." "It shouldn't have been," said Mrs. Winton, and I caught her funny look at the gardener. "You were some time in the maze, Mr. Pine. Nothing happened, did it? That is, did you lose your way?" "Only a couple of thousand times." "No singing?" said Keenan, looking down. "Pardon?" "I think there's a diagram of the maze in the library," said Mrs. Winton. "Perhaps you'd like to have another go tomorrow." "Isn't there rain forecast for tomorrow?" "Not until the evening. Well, I think it's about lunchtime. You must be starved, Mr. Pine. Afterwards, we'll see if we can find the diagram of the maze. While Mrs. Winton cut bread in the kitchen, I asked, "By the way, what does this mean?" And I read slowly from the back of the parking ticket. Retine quod aqua coercitur. It means keep that which is bound by water, she replied without a moment's hesitation, as if the phrase had been in her thoughts all along. The library, like everything else in and about Woodthorpe Manor, daunted me. It wasn't that it was large. In fact, it was much smaller than the average public library. It was that all these volumes, 5,000 Mrs. Winton told me, and some of them incredibly old and rare, were a private collection. And there was that word again, private. And here was I. It didn't add up. Mrs. Winton made straight for one of the glass cabinets lining the walls, unlocked it, and after a moment's search took from between two books a leather wallet. In this was the plan of the maze with its convoluted paths, its statuary, brooks, and miniature gardens all plotted out. The middle, however, was blank. "What's in there?" I remembered asking this before without getting an answer. "I'm sure I don't know," Mrs. Winton said. "It's been closed for many a year." I thought it odd that in all her time at the manor she'd never once been curious enough to find out what was behind the wall and trees in the centre of the maze. Perhaps she had no interest in things outside her own sphere. Perhaps she'd asked once and been rebuffed. Perhaps she was lying. I was glad I didn't have to dress for dinner, being as it was in the servants' hall, wearing attires against my religion as a confirmed slouch. There was just Mrs. Winton, Keenan and myself at table. The only other people on the estate at this time were those who lived in the lodge, the gatekeeper and his wife, and their two sons who served as groundsmen during the night. The talk got around, rather quickly I thought, to the maze. Yes, I copied out the diagram. Perhaps I'll have another go at the maze tomorrow if it doesn't rain. Well, yes, I think it will rain tomorrow, Mrs. Winton. I can smell it. Keenan kept pretty quiet during the meal, just picking at his food, though drinking steadily, making casualties of 2 bottles of rough red. Drinking with a purpose was a phrase that came to mind. I got the impression he was sulking, probably after an argument with Mrs. Winton, which probably had me in it somewhere. This line of thought seemed to be confirmed when, during a lapse in the housekeeper's conversation about the various notables who dined and slept at the manor over the centuries, Keenan muttered, "And you're only the second Australian we've..." He jolted as though kicked. He glared at Mrs. Winton in a half-focused way. She continued her dinner as if nothing had happened. I would hate to have played poker with her. I excused myself not long after that and wandered upstairs to the library. I paused halfway up, listening for the explosion I thought must erupt in the servants' hall, but all remained quiet. They probably were at each other again, but in a restrained way, which befitted this stately home. I'd noticed that the library had been catalogued on the Dewey Decimal System, and that the cabinet where the maze diagram was shelved was labelled 133. The listing for books on occult matters. I guessed it was a Woodthorpe family joke, as occult can also mean hidden. Luckily, the cabinet was still unlocked. That afternoon I'd seen a first edition of Elliot O'Donnell's Screaming Skulls, with which I hoped to read myself to sleep. While looking for the O'Donnell, I came across a folder bound in red buckram that had the appearance of a scrapbook or diary. Conscience and curiosity tugged me in opposite directions. Curiosity won. The date on the first page was 26th of July 1823. The handwriting was crabbed and for the most part illegible. A sure sign my conscience took glee in reminding me that it had been meant for the writer's eyes only. I leafed over the pages, pausing here and there to attempt to decipher a passage, a sentence, or even just a word, usually without any luck. But partway down the second page was a word beginning with K, followed by something like Birdfellow. Whoever or whatever this may have been, both names were referred to several times throughout the diary. Another name that was repeated, though only in the last few pages, was Mother Gwyn. She seemed somehow to be associated with that Latin phrase about being bound by water, as it was referred to in semi-legible printing on 2 separate pages immediately following her name. About the middle of the diary I managed, "The groundkeepers have communicated their distress in that there are shapes abroad." Nowhere was the writer identified. Before I left the library, I noticed in passing that the folder had been shelved tightly against Wentworth Day's "Here Are Ghosts and Witches." I sat at my window for a long time, alternately reading Screaming Skulls, trying to decipher more of the diary, and watching the long summer twilight come in, all English and still new to me. Nothing like sunset at home, where the night falls out of the afternoon sky like a black weight. In the distance were the tops of the trees standing inside that inner wall of the maze. Perhaps it was the fading light, or my eyes tired from reading, but I could have sworn they were nodding and tossing, although there wasn't a breath of wind anywhere. Next morning I woke up early and ragged, having had nightmares of screaming skulls half the night. A phone was ringing somewhere downstairs, and 10 minutes later, as I passed the drawing room, I heard Mrs. Winton saying, "Booked a room as per your instructions, my lord." I scratched up a bit of breakfast for myself and was just cracking into a boiled egg when Mrs. Winton entered the kitchen. She said, "Oh, Mr. Pine," and for several seconds more found nothing else to say. Then, "Have you been here long?" 3 minutes, unless your egg time is slow." I wondered if she'd meant, "Did you overhear me on the telephone?" I said, "Was that his lordship?" "Yes, it was." She made a pretence of looking out the window. "It's going to be a lovely day today. If you're going for a hike around the grounds, I'll make you a packed lunch. What would you like?" Subtle, yes, in a sledgehammer way. Half an hour later I picked up a small hamper bag from the entrance hall table. It was heavier than a roast beef sandwich had a right to be, so I checked it out. Sandwiches, bottle of cordial, binoculars. "All right," I muttered to myself, "all right, I'll play your silly game," and headed for the maze. Keenan was outside the stables, arming his contracted gardeners with hoes, rakes, and other implements. He glanced my way as I passed, then turned back quickly to his charges. It was a sure thing bet that he knew as much as Mrs. Winton why I was being guested here at the manor against, as I was beginning to suppose, the Earl's instructions. It all had to do with the maze. I stopped at its entrance, remembering its complexity, feeling defeated, already lost. I didn't have much faith in my copy of the diagram. Still, I stepped through the gate, straight into a sticky splash of whitewash. A few steps on was another splash and another. Soon I was following a trail of whitewash and the prints of gardeners' Wellingtons past the dead flower beds and dry ornate fountains, over dwarfish bridges and dusty ruts, in and out of wall gaps, past stone benches and statuary, and a sundial that was an hour behind the times. Following this whitewash paper chase, it took me only 10 minutes to reach the centre. Unsurprisingly, the ancient padlock was gone, the iron gate ajar. Retine quod aqua coercitur. "I think those Indians are friendly, General Custer," I muttered, and pushed hard on the gate. It grated open onto a lawn run amok. The sight of all that long grass made me think instinctively of snakes. Then I remembered where I was, and that Britain has just one poisonous snake whose track record is 10 people in 100 years. Hoping there wasn't an adder out there that could count to 11, I waded in. It had once been a sloping lawn, and what it sloped down to was a pond that was perhaps 15 metres across. I stumbled down to the edge where the water was deep green with algae. With a long stick I tried to find the bottom and couldn't. I looked out over the lake. It was utterly flat, undisturbed by fish or bird, and I began to wonder what I might see break the surface if I sat down to wait. But I didn't want to sit down. Instead, I set off along the stone path running beside the lake, kicking moss pads into the water. At one place I almost joined them as I tripped over a rusty ring fixed into the stone. It sported a rag of rope, giving the look of a mooring point, which I supposed it to be. But whatever, it had been a hell of a long time since anyone had taken a punt out here. Further along were the wooden remains of what may well have been a small summer house halfway up the slope. Once upon a time, this had been a pleasure garden of the most stylish kind. Today, all it had were its memories, whatever they were, and an air of ruined elegance. Why, with the rest of the grounds so carefully manicured, had this garden been forgotten? I spotted the island. It had been hidden by the foliage. In an instant I had the binoculars out of the bag and up to my eyes. An island, a tiny island overgrown with grass and bushes. But here and there they were threaded through by pathways, and in a couple of places the weathered stone of some broken structure poked into view. Something moved. I joggled the glasses trying to sharpen focus. I could have sworn something had flitted past a break in the bushes. But no, nothing out there moved now. Perhaps it had been imagination, or maybe a bird flitting from one branch to another. If it had been a bird, it was the only animal life I'd seen so far in this garden. The pond, if properly cleaned out, would have been ideally suited for ducks and carp. Probably had been once, though that would have been long, long ago. I continued on, hoping to find a bridge to the island. Instead, I found something else. It lay in the water ahead. Stencilled letters and numbers along one side of the rubber raft proclaimed it a Navy surplus job, which put the kibosh on my good fairies theory. Obviously, it was a set-up, and it was obvious by who. Only the why of it all remained as murky as the pond. But here was the raft, and over there was the island. Paddling slow, I did a circuit of the island looking for a place to land. In a sort of little cove, I found a jetty, but its fungus-covered poles, rotted boards and smell of decay kept me paddling. Finally, I found a bit of pebbly beach and ran ashore there. A path of discoloured stones went round and round, looking like a maze within a maze. The notion seemed to fit the landscape, but no other path crossed this one, so I supposed it led to a definite destination. I was right, and I came to it suddenly. What had to have been the original for the white marble second pavilion out in the grounds. But this one was much smaller and a ruin. Its foundations had sunk, cracking the walls, toppling one of its columns and opening the roof. The interior was a green riot of weeds. I wandered around it, trying to find an answer to this garden's isolation. Not that I knew what I was looking for, nor was I sure it was here just because this was the middle of the maze. It just seemed like a more likely place than any other. All I found was a bone, half buried in the dirt. Although I wasn't sure what sort of bone it was. I was fairly sure what sort of bone it wasn't. It wasn't human. Trying to remember my biology lessons, I thought it might be the wing bone of some large bird. A swan seemed the likeliest. I dug into the dirt a bit deeper, but couldn't find any more of the beast. It was good to sit in the English sun eating roast beef sandwiches and drinking orange cordial on that extraordinary within a maze island, my back propped against marble ruins. But soon clouds were scudding over from Cornwall, and before I was even through the inner gate, heavy raindrops were pattering down. Getting wet wasn't my only problem. The whitewash marks on the path were blurring as the rain increased, and before long the best I could do was look for white streaks on the stonework. I was pretty much a white streak myself as I splashed through the east front and shook the water off like a dog. The smell of brewing coffee and a cheery crockery clatter did nothing for me at all, but I stopped outside the kitchen door in the hope of overhearing something. Keenan was saying, "It's come on to rain." "Has it?" I thought, and squelched upstairs to change. The distance to the local village of Harringford-in-the-Vale was longer than I thought. But the rain had gone, the afternoon sun was out, and I felt I needed a good long walk to anywhere away from Woodthorpe Manor. Coming down from changing, I'd met Mrs. Winton like a spectre on the stairs. "Went into the maze again?" she asked at once, a question I dodged with a few unpleasantries about English weather. She took the hint, but I knew she wouldn't let it up for long. I could see now with the clarity of 2020 hindsight that her curious behaviour had started the moment she'd clapped eyes on my ghost books, and was compounded by my blabbing about my ghost hunting experience. Yes, and how disappointed she'd looked when I voiced my attitude towards further ghost hunts. So now it was subterfuge and manipulation, and it all centred about the maze. The only thing that puzzled me was why she'd waited for a ghost hunter to fall accidentally into her clutches when Britain is the home of the ghost hunter. The only difference I could see was one of nationality, but I couldn't think how it would have a bearing on the matter. A ghost is a ghost is a ghost, no matter who hunts it. Perhaps I could have, perhaps I should have, confronted Mrs. Winton then and there on the stairs, ask her if she was having me look into a haunting without me knowing I was doing it. But then she would have just said, "How lovely, the sun's back out, run along and play in the maze again." I could have threatened to leave, of course, but that seemed childish somehow, and might have only made matters worse. Besides, I'd never find out what it had all been about, and that would have driven me crazy. The only way to tackle the situation was to arm myself with some information, and the only place to get it was in town. Harrington-in-the-Vale was an inn, a church, a huddle of shops, a scatter of cottages along a main road or high street that was neither as main nor as high as it had been before the advent of the motorway bypass. But it did possess a side street, and at the end of the side street I found Scuddamore's Engineering Workshop, a do-it-all fix-it place that repaired just about anything, a grand sort of name for what looked like a First World War aeroplane hangar. Fact is, I thought I could make out Sopwith in faded paint over the doors. Asking about, I was told Mr. Scudamore himself was working on the Norton. I found him in a corner of the workshop, refitting the exhaust system, handling the machinery with an expertise that had me wondering if he'd learnt his engineering from James Lansdowne Norton personally. He seemed old enough. He said, "So you're Ernie Pine. His lordship telephoned, said he'd put you up at the inn, but when I called there, they'd not heard of you." No. For the last 2 days I've been staying at the manor." He peered at me over the bike's petrol tank as if I'd just admitted to being Jack the Ripper. "Do what?" "The housekeeper and the head gardener have conspired to keep me at the manor for as long as they can." I explained why, adding, "Is there any sort of story connected with the maze, particularly the garden and the island inside?" "Oh, didn't know there was a garden and island inside it. That there maze been locked up for donkey's years, ever since some kids got in one night and came out screaming, not knowing why. They never was really right in the head after that. Grew up with a proper hate for crows and magpies and didn't like hot winds neither. Made 'em go mad, almost like a fit. Sorriest thing I ever saw, watching young Johnny Wilkes one hot summer day, crawling about and bawling his eyes out for no reason he could ever tell us." "But there's no ghost story to explain what happened to those kids in the maze?" "Oh, not really. There's a legend of the blackamoor's ghost that run amok in the manor until it got nailed down some way by a North Country witch woman, but that has naught to do with the maze. Her name wouldn't have been Mother Gwyn, would it? There's naught saying who she was. The Woodthorpes don't speak of the matter. He fell to thinking for a moment, then added, But I think I might once have seen a picture of him when I was a kiddie and up at the manor for a Christmas do. They set a marquee on the lawn, but I got away somehow and played a game of hide-and-seek with myself in the manor house where I weren't supposed to be. He chuckled at his memories. Well, one way or another I managed to get right up under the roof when I found this painting there, just lying on its face. So I picked it up. All expression of happy memories disappeared as he said, I tell you, I near died of fright because it weren't the sort of painting a 6-year-old expects to find in the roof of the manor house at Christmas. It was the head of a black man, like a ebony block all chopped about to make a face. His hair and beard was grey, especially the beard, all stringy-like, and had a little pouch tied into it. If he was the one haunting the manor way back when, I said, thinking things through, it could be that the witch woman stopped it by having his body buried on the island maze. There's a notion in magic that spirits lose strength if they have to cross water. It's a thought, isn't it? Said Mr. Scudamore. It was indeed, and I was thinking on it as I asked my way to my next port of call, the local vet. The Norton was growling along beautifully as I approached Woodthorpe Manor late that afternoon. The sun hung low in the west, and this time I wasn't flattened by a sudden big silver car. Throttle back, lean in through the gateway, twist the grip, crackle up the drive. The 2 groundsmen were emerging from the lodge to begin their evening rounds as I passed. Big boys carrying big sticks, they stared for a moment, then waved. I'd never met them, though I expected Keenan had spun them some story to explain my presence at the manor. Perhaps they were even in on the conspiracy. Paranoid as that might sound, with what I'd heard from Mr. Scudamore, and especially from the vet, I was prepared to find almost anything under the bed now. A face pulled away from an upstairs window as I pulled up outside the east front. Now, I thought, perhaps now that I look on the verge of leaving, Mrs. Winton might be forced to resort to honesty. She must have flown like a broomstick to get from that upstairs room to the entrance hall where I met her a few seconds later. Well, she said, after looking at me as if for the first time. Well, I suppose I'll be off now. I was grinning inside, lying through my back teeth and loving it. Right now? I've imposed long enough. Her expression was saying, please impose. Oh, by the way, I continued, I found this on the Maze Island and produced from my jacket pocket the bone. Did you know the local vet used to work at the London Zoo? He was able to tell me that this is part of the wing bone of the Australian emu bird. Now, how do you suppose? I would never have guessed Mrs. Winton to be the fainting kind. It's like Burke and Hare. I said nothing to Keenan's comment, apt though it was. The sun was going down, the shadow of the marble ruin creeping over us. I just kept digging. Mrs. Winton had revived after a moment, and I'd helped to get her into a sitting position on the stairs. You should never have taken the bone from the island, she said, settling herself against the banisters. It was the only thing that really held him there, that and the water, though the water won't stop him now once the sun goes down. You should have told me all this and a lot more besides in the first place. You would have left. I should leave now. He'll run amok. All the more reason to scram. I let that sink in a moment. He's the black man whose ghost haunted the manor in the early 1800s, isn't he? She nodded. Actually, he's from New South Wales. His name was Corabilla, but they called him Birdfellow because he practised bird magic. I see. It takes an Australian ghost hunter to hunt an Australian ghost. 12 investigators over the past 5 years haven't even known where to start. All they could tell his lordship was to let sleeping dogs lie, but they haven't looked across the grounds on still evenings to see the trees in the centre of the maze tossing and tossing. They've never felt as if there's an animal out there crashing against its cage, and that one day it'll break out. And the bone? I held it up to eye level. Mrs. Winton flinched. I suppose you've been talking to Mr. Scudamore? Yes. Back in 1823, the 11th Earl brought this bird fellow back from a voyage into the Pacific. Which explains the palm and the gum trees and the grounds, I said. She nodded again, nervously. The Earl thought to train him as a servant and perhaps even have him work magic. But Birdfellow ran away only a week after coming to the manor. It must have been a terribly alien place to him, England, I mean. He didn't know how to survive in one of our winters, and so he died. But it wasn't long before his ghost began plaguing the manor in the shape of a monstrous bird like an ostrich. Emu, I said. Was it? Servants and tenant farmers ran off and livestock died. So the Earl called in the witch known as Mother Gwyn. She told him the body had to be surrounded by moving water, and to bury that, she gestured at the bone I was holding, with him, as it was his source of magic. That stopped the haunting, though it didn't put him to rest. Possibly Mr. Scudamore told you about the children who wandered into the maze one night. I nodded. When the brooks running into the maze dried up 5 years ago, the pond water stopped moving and the ghost began to come out into the maze itself. If it wasn't for the bone, the ghost would have broken loose. It's going to break loose tonight. She peered despairingly through the banisters. I sat down beside her. What if I put the bone back? The spell's broken, she said, and she was probably right. Mother Gwyn said he couldn't rest because he wasn't buried in his own land, so you might think the obvious thing would be to ship his remains back to Australia. But she warned that the moment his bones leave the island, he'll come chasing them. What had been so wrong with winter back home? I tried to remember all I knew about Aboriginal burial customs, which took about 10 seconds. All I came up with was something to do with trees, a half-formed idea at best. Then, scraping the bottom of my brain, I recalled that during an inquest into black deaths in police custody, the court was instructed to refer to the dead only as dead fella and dead lady, as it was Aboriginal law that no record of the name, no image or belongings of the individual must be allowed to exist after death. I said, there may be a second reason why Birdfellow doesn't rest. Is there anything connected to him that's still in the house? Writings, drawings, paintings, belongings? There's only the diary I hoped you'd find on the library shelf and a portrait painting up in the roof. I suddenly remembered where trees might come into all of this. Better find it and bring it with the diary to the southeast lawn. Get the groundsman to hollow out one of the gum trees with axes. What are you going to do? Shift old Birdfellow's bones. The front door opened. Keenan entered, his footsteps echoing in the hall, slowing to a stop at the bottom of the stairs. He saw the emu bone in my hand and went very pale. But I won't be shifting the bones alone, I said, and meant it. It's like Burke hair. I said nothing to Keenan's comment. The sun was going down, the shadow of the marble ruin creeping over us. I just kept digging, and presently our shovels brought up vertebrae. Birdfellow had been buried face down, an ancient way of burying the feared dead. We dug with small spades, with our hands, and with the care of archaeologists, gathering up the arms, legs, pelvis, ribs, every vertebra, every finger and toe bone, and of course the skull and its grey stringy beard with the little kangaroo skin pouch tied into its strands. This contains magic powders, I said to Keenan, trying to sound like I knew what I was talking about as I placed the pouch in the canvas sack with the bones. One of the eye teeth on the lower jaw was missing, had probably been knocked out as part of manhood initiation ceremonies. But to make sure, we sifted the bottom of the grave until just on sunset, when we made a hurried retreat from the island. As we reached the gate in the inner wall, I yielded to temptation and turned around for one quick look. There was a shadow over the island, somehow darker than the night coming on, a shadow that seemed to flex out across the water. I hurried Keenan through the gate, pulling it shut on its rusty hinges. We were out of the garden, but not yet out of the woods. There was still a long, crooked course ahead of us to the southeast lawn. A couple of minutes later, and several alleys into the maze, we became aware of a growing dryness in the air, a smell of deserts and a sense of open spaces. "A ghost is following its bones," said Keenan. I nodded. "God knows what'll happen if it finds them, and God help us if it finds them with us." "I think it's about to catch up," whispered Keenan. We dodged through a gap into a dead-end hide. The bones in the sack rattled of their own accord. We hugged it tightly, smothering the sound. Then Keenan went, "Ugh!" as something writhed inside the bag. We flung it from us. It hit the ground with a dry crunch, then began to squirm as if something alive was inside, fluttering, pushing, clawing to get out. I kicked it back against the wall where Keenan and I stood on it, hearing bones snap. It was only then that I realised there was the sound of birds in my head, getting closer. We lay down with our faces to the wall, making ourselves small and silent with our arms wrapped around the bag. The bird sounds and the desert dryness grew, seemed to beat against the wall we'd hid behind, then faded. We waited a minute, maybe two, but heard, felt, smelt no more. We did the bone bag shuffle back into the main alley. Keenan, while we'd been digging up Birdfellow's grave, told me he'd had Mrs. Winton coaching him on the ins and outs of the maze from the library diagram since the night of my arrival. An unsurprising revelation. So I followed on blind faith. He took what he explained was the roundabout way out, as the ghost would be stalking the more direct route, at least at first. Both of us wanted to carry the sack by its extreme edges, but we knew it would only rattle again. So we held it close, all the time afraid of sudden squirmings. We had torches but didn't dare use them. There was half a moon out, which helped sometimes, but a lot of the alleys were still in deep shadow. A kookaburra's laugh, a strident of mental noise right between the ears, no telling direction or how close. We froze. "It's trying to psych us, make us panic," I said, not admitting how good a job it was doing on me. "It's probably reached the entrance and now knows we're still here." Keenan wet his lips. "If it's at the entrance, we're trapped. It can just sit there and wait." "Yeah, that's a thought." It's what I would have done if I were the ghost, but then I wasn't the ghost. We were huddling in the shadows of a 5-way junction of alleys, looking this way and that and over our shoulders when it happened. The bag wriggled and a skeletal arm ripped out, thrusting into the air, wavered a moment, then clutched at Keenan's throat. The old man yelled, and the arm fell back into the sack with a laugh of clattering bones. "No more!" Keenan yelled. He threw the sack from him. "No more! No more!" He ran. And so did I, because panic is contagious. A blur of walls, of benches and statues, a blaze of stars as I ran headlong into a dead end. I collapsed, dazed and shaking, eyes watering from the blow to my nose. And in all of this, the raucous cawing of crows heard with the mind and a human scream heard with the ears. Then silence. For a long time, only silence. Something was scraping along the pavement outside in the main alley, coming nearer. A scrape, a pause. A scrape, a pause, coming on, coming near. I tried not to imagine what it was. I wished I had a stick to smash its bones to dust. The only moonlight in this alley was far up one wall. All else was dark. I felt for the torch in my pocket. I had to will my hand to switch it on. It was almost at my feet, that one arm, bones white in the light, dragging the bag behind it. The bag reared up as I stood there, staring stupidly. The bony fingers spread and struck. The torch went spinning, hit the wall, went out. Finger bones, cold and clicking, smelling of the grave, dug into my face. The bones in the bag knifed through the sacking, into my leg, into my side. I pulled away, bringing my head against the wall, smashing the hand against stone. Its grip loosened. I wrenched it from me, but the finger bones closed about my hand, trying to crush it, make me cry out so the spirit of these bones stalking the alleys would come. I pushed to my knees with all my strength, swinging the arm, bringing the bag around it in a half circle, smashing it against the wall. Bones splintered with a lovely crack, but the grip was still there. I swung the bag again and again. "God damn it, I'm trying to help you!" Finally, the arm itself snapped and the bag sagged to the ground like a KO'd fighter, the skeletal hand dead in mine. As quick as I could, I shoved all the bones I could find back in the sack. There were noises in my head like tinkling bells, the bush chimes of the bellbird getting louder and louder. I limped from the dead-end alley, dragging the bag behind me. Now where, I asked myself. I had no idea which way I'd ran, not even which way was in and out. Birds were singing, chiming in my head louder than before. I struggled off as fast as my leg and side would allow, leaving a trail of blood old blind Harry could have followed. I was trying to find a familiar statue or flower bed, but everything looked so unfamiliar. Behind me the maze pushed back into angles of darkness where a form, a shape glided and flitted. Parrots screeched. I'm dead, I thought. But a long moment passed and nothing happened. Something lying on the path back down the alley caught my eye. It was a bone fallen from the sack, and it occurred to me then that maybe other bones had fallen out of rips in the bag, and that the thing tracking me had been stopping to pick them up with an exulting cry of parrots. Hoping this was true, I dropped a rib here, a collarbone there, to keep it busy as I worked my way through the maze. I was beginning to feel the loss of blood, starting to get cold, dizzy and tired. It wouldn't be long, I knew, before I'd get to the point where I'd throw down all the bones, sink down into sleep, and never wake up. A sundial at midnight is a useless thing, but the moment I stumbled up to it, I hugged its pedestal, knowing now there was a fighting chance. It was a landmark I remembered. Nearby was one of my dirt mounds from yesterday, further along another and another. Along this dead oblong garden and through that gap, over to the right and round to the left, a backtrack here, and I dropped an ankle bone at the gate, hoping it would slow down just that little bit more. It was still some distance to the southeast lawn and I was in no condition to sprint. There were lights on in the house, far away. The grounds were moonlit, except for the slim sticks of tree shadows. "Hello!" said someone from a distance. I stared behind me, disoriented, saw the gate to the maze swinging wide. The next thing I knew I was being picked up off the grass where I'd collapsed. Someone said, "Quick!" and someone else said, "For God's sake, don't look back!" They carried me and the bones between them like so much hand luggage toward a waiting smell of petrol. I must have been holding onto the bag with a death grip, as they didn't even try to take it from me. They just ripped open the bag, and I saw, as if from a long way away, the two groundsmen tumbling bones into the newly hollowed-out gum tree. There was just one more thing to be done, and damn it, it should have been done already. Mrs. Winton, hands fluttering with nerves, stepped back from the painting of Birdfellow, an old black man with a mysterious pouch tied into his stringy grey beard. Beside the painting, face up and open, was the diary. Mrs. Winton looked down at them, shook her head sorrowfully. "It has to be," I said, surprised at the croak my voice had become. "No images, no record of name, nothing of the dead must be allowed to exist after death. It's their way of life. It's that portrait and his name in that diary that's keeping him earthbound and angry just as much as not giving him a proper tree burial in 1823. From the direction of the maze came the sound of something big galloping across the manor grounds toward us. A match scratched a spark. The petrol-soaked painting and diary woofed into flame. In that sudden glare I glimpsed the emu, far bigger than any in nature. Its neck was an elongated travesty of a human neck, and far above it a human face of ebony and grey. In that instant I read in its features anger, and then happiness? Birdfellow's portrait had crisped. The book, each word and name shrivelling, had become an open flower of fire. A few seconds later, I looked back into the silent darkness and knew we were alone. Later that night they found Keenan wandering the maze, eyes vacant and staring. It was many days before he was reeled back to reality, before doctors were able to convince him that his eyes had not been clawed out. He never went back to the manor, having now an aversion to birds and their noises. Where in the world he'll find a place without birds is a place I can't imagine. Certainly not the Maze Island, which now teems with waterfowl. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall the afternoon Mrs. Winton explained things to his lordship, in particular why one of his trees on the south-east lawn had been so strangely mutilated then plastered over. But on that afternoon I was still in the local hospital being treated for, among other things, serious loss of blood and what the doctors described as nervous exhaustion. "If there's anything to be learned from all this," Keenan said the day they wheeled me down to his ward for a visit, "it's that you should always put things back where you found them." And it was just such a thought that had me laugh near to breaking my stitches when I read that the Earl of Woodthorpe had cut down a gum tree in his manor grounds and was air freighting it out to Australia. Naturally, most people assumed the Earl's mind had thrown a rod. I knew otherwise.
That was Rick Kennett's The Outsider, as read by Graeme Dunlop. Graeme Dunlop is a software solution architect and voice actor living in Melbourne, Australia. He is the co-editor of the fantasy podcast Podcastle and used to be the host of YA podcast Cast of Wonders. He occasionally tweets as @Kibitzer on Twitter. It's great to hear your voice again, Graeme. Thanks for joining us. Our final tale tonight comes from another author who's no stranger to Tales to Terrify, John Everson. John's first tale with our podcast, Green Apples, was aired way back on episode 7, and this is his 11th with the show to date. John Everson is the Bram Stoker award-winning author of a dozen novels of horror and the supernatural, including Voodoo Heart, The Devil's Equinox, and Covenant. He's also a staunch advocate for the culinary joys of the jalapeno and an unabashed fan of European giallo cinema. Praised by Booklist and Cemetery Dance, Kirkus Reviews called his work hard to put down, while author Edward Lee said, "Everson is a master of the hardcore. He's the rare kind of writer who's so good you can't proceed with your day until the book is finished." Everson has written licensed stories for Kolchak the Night Stalker, The Vampire Diaries, and Jonathan Maberry's V-Wars. In 2019, V-Wars was turned into a Netflix series that included Everson's characters, Danica and Mia Dubov. Learn more at johneverson.com. Sit back, relax, let the chills wash over you with John Everson's The Last Word, a Tales to Terrify anniversary episode exclusive.
Be careful what you read. Be careful what you say. You might not believe this. You might not believe me, but Words are powerful things. You don't think about it because you use them all day, every day, without thinking much about it. You hear others use them all day long too, the idle chatter of co-workers, the nagging cajoling of spouses, the vacant conversations of friends speaking just to pass the time. The fake banter of television and radio ads, the passionate lyrics of songs playing through the day from your computer speakers on Spotify. We are surrounded by words, and most of them are not only lacking in meaning, but intentionally, or more often unintentionally, false, deceptive, misleading. Words are misused and malformed all day, every day. There are billions of them, most of them vacuous, released into the world every day. But don't be deceived. Words are powerful things. Certain words, said at certain times, in certain ways. Some words can kill. I wish I had never opened that thin, dusty book. The words I read inside it changed my life, threatened my life, and so I leave this warning. I only hope that there is someone left to read it. I had driven over 100 miles to escape words. I didn't want to hear any more of the empty promises and gaslighting stories designed to guilt me into doing things to save someone else from their own inadequate skills and planning. My girlfriend, Amy, had backed out of coming along at the last minute, and to be honest, while I was initially annoyed at the fact that my backwoods escape would now not include sex with another human, I was also somewhat relieved. I wouldn't have to endure her words. Why don't you? Why do you? Why aren't you? I pulled my backpack and tightly rolled tent out of the trunk of my tiny Mazda and slung both across my shoulders. I filled my pockets with my phone, a lighter, a pocket knife, and other minor implements, and slammed the door in a gesture of finality. Goodbye. The woods were just steps away from my car. A twig-laden trail led from the small parking lot into the copse of trees that included specimens hundreds of years old. These were old woods. While there was a parking lot and a trail entry, this was not a place that many people visited, remote, undeveloped. I had no doubt that many of the trees here predated the signing of our Constitution. This land had resisted the hand of man, and I longed to disappear within it. With one glance at the broken asphalt of the parking lot, I said my goodbyes to today and stepped onto the trail that led into the heart of yesterday. The forest knew. The forest remembered. The forest was not eternal, but it was close. The first hour or so of my hike was uneventful. Eventually, the trail grew wild. Soon there was no trail at all. I threaded my way through wild brambles and empty spaces between trees that had grown so tall that their lowest branches were yards above my head. I was moving steadily downhill through clearings and dense cover. There would be a river or large creek bed when I reached the bottom, and that is where I had intended to set up camp. I heard the water before I saw it, a gentle gurgle and drip through the brush. With the hum of insects and the call of birds, it made for a perfect backdrop of non-human sound. My soul felt at perfect peace for the first time in weeks, maybe months. And then, just as I reached a clearing and saw the outline of a narrow but deep riverbed ahead, I saw the grey outline of something that was not of the forest. Something human. A small, grey, weathered cabin. I approached it slowly. I didn't want to be shot for trespassing, but by the time I reached the door, I knew I was safe. This cabin had not been tenanted in a long, long time. The windows were opaque with dust and spiderwebs. The wood of the small porch had rotted through in several spots. The door made a horrendous rusty creak when I turned the knob and forced it open. Somehow it had maintained its integrity against the elements despite literal decades of neglect. The furnishings inside were Spartan, a couple of wooden chairs tucked under a square wooden table. 2 small tables with candle holders and half-melted candles on top, a fireplace with a rough-hewn mantel where there were more candles, and a row of handmade dolls. Everything was grey with years of slowly accumulated dust. I couldn't imagine how long it had been since anyone had lived here. Beyond the front room was a small kitchen with another table and chairs, and a wood-burning stove. No old refrigerator or microwave or anything like that. No electricity out here. One of the doors in the kitchen opened into a pantry. I grimaced at the jars that still lined the shelves there. How old were these canned jams? Or pickles? The jars were so dark, I couldn't tell what was preserved inside. Another door opened to a small bedroom. It was as minimalistic as the rest of the house. A twin bed with a hand-stuffed mattress draped in yellowed sheets. A thin chest of drawers. I pulled out the top 2 and found a small collection of trinkets and jewellery. The next held socks, panties, bras. There were outer clothes in the next drawer, and all of them feminine. So, a woman had lived out here a long time ago. Alone. From the clear tracks of my footsteps across the floor, no man or animal had been inside here in years. I walked back and forth between the 3 rooms and found no evidence of animals having infiltrated the confines, which, frankly, was a miracle. I had planned on camping in the woods, but now I reconsidered. There was no running water or power, but there was shelter, and as I forced open the back door that exited the kitchen into an overgrown clearing behind the house, I heard more than the complaint of a weathered, warped door. The rumble of thunder threatened overhead. A small wooden structure was visible a few yards away from the house, nearly hidden by bushes and tall grass, an outhouse. I raised an eyebrow at that. I might set up camp in the house, but I'd make other arrangements for the facilities. The thunder pealed again, louder this time, and I nodded. After taking a leak near a trunk out back, I lit the candles in the front room and kitchen and eased my way into one of the chairs. It looked as if someone had fashioned it by hand, and I worried that it would be old and brittle, but it held my weight. I pulled out a bottle of Jack Daniels and prepared myself to weather the storm. There was a small stack of towels in the pantry, and when the rain began, I took a couple pots outside and let them fill with water. After an hour and another drink, I brought them in and saved one for drinking, while the other became my wash bucket. I don't mind roughing it, but I was not going to spend a week in here breathing in dust bunnies. I started with the table and chairs, and then wiped down the mantel, the tables, and the spiderwebbed front windows. It was a miracle I still held out the elements. The wood was clearly dry-rotted. Over the course of the night, and several trips to the outdoors to gather fresh rainwater, I managed to wipe everything down in the front room, and then got down on my hands and knees and washed the old wood floors as well. By the time I unrolled my sleeping bag and slept inside, I was feeling pretty good about my candlelit palace in the woods. Maybe tomorrow I'd even see about lighting the fireplace. My head hurt the next morning, but when the sun burned its way through the newly cleaned windows to shine a spotlight on my face, I couldn't ignore it. The warmth on my neck and the fullness of my bladder and the unpleasantly hard base of the wooden floor beneath my sleeping bag insisted. Rise and shine. I surveyed the room and nodded. For a place that had been abandoned in the woods for God knows how many years, it actually looked pretty homey. I stumbled through the kitchen and out into the back door, walking towards the outhouse. I wouldn't go inside, but, well, it was as good a place as any to mark my new territory. After eating a couple of granola bars and wishing for something hot with lots of caffeine instead of canteen water, I decided to scope out my surroundings. The river was just a few yards away, and after last night's rain, running fast. But while there was still a clearing around the house, really everything else was thick with bushes and brush and trees. The house was enclosed by the forest, in fact. I felt as if I'd truly pushed open the gate and walked into the middle of nowhere. And that was fine for me. When my phone buzzed with a notification from work, I shook my head and turned the device completely off, without reading it. No words from the outside world. Not here. That afternoon, I spent cleaning the kitchen with water I lugged up from the river, and eventually started on the bedroom. I washed some old sheets out in the river and laid them on the grass out back to dry. I decided to see if I could make the bed sleepable and dragged the mattress, I was right, it was hand-stuffed with feathers, out to the back to pound the dust out of it. The first couple hand claps brought out such a cloud that I ended up in a gagging, coughing spasm. Eventually, when the dust clouds diminished, I dragged it back inside and covered it with 3 sheets to make sure whatever crap was still inside couldn't creep or seep out. It was while I was shimmying the bed base back and forth to tuck the sheets in that I discovered the book. The wooden frame had moved across the floor a few inches, and I saw the old edge of the leather volume poking out. I knelt down. I looked underneath. There was just bare floor, some dust bunnies, and the book. I pulled it out from beneath and sat down on the newly made bed to take a look. It was a diary. The diary of Gwyneth Piermont, last keeper of the word, according to the inscription on the first page. There was a date on the page too, and the numbers made my eyes widen. June 13th, 1957, it said. Almost 65 years ago. Her first entry set the stage for everything that was to follow.
I have arrived at the keep. Agatha trained me for this moment many years ago, and when I received her letter, I tried my best to follow her directions and get here before it was too late. But, alas, when I arrived, Agatha was no more. It was unpleasant, but I was able to get her body out of the small house and buried near an old sycamore out back. She had mentioned the tree to me in her letters, and it was easy to find, towering above so many others in a knoll near the river. A tree of strength and protection. The ancient book which contains the last word, handed down for generations and now handed from Agatha to myself, was still lying on a table next to her bed. I wondered if she had read it in those last hours before she died. I put it away in my cupboard. I don't want to be tempted to read it, because in reading, one is primed to action, and the one action I must never do is to speak the word. Better to put it away and stand guard as so many sisters have over the years. For now I must settle into my new life here in the wilderness, alone.
A few days later, she wrote again, this time talking about her days of cleaning the house and tending the overgrown garden Agatha had left behind. I read a couple more entries, largely dealing with her domestic pursuits, and finally set the book down. I needed to perform some domestic pursuits myself, or I was going to be starving out here soon. I had stuffed some mac and cheese and a pack of dried vegetables in the bottom of my backpack, and now it was time to get a fire going so that I could boil some water. The real question was, could I use the fireplace without burning the whole shack down? And the answer turned out to be yes. Something, probably a bird nest, caught fire briefly up in the flue. Some things fell down from the shaft and into the logs, but after half an hour or so I stood outside and saw a steady flow of smoke escaping the top of the chimney. A half hour after that, I had one of Gwyneth's old pots sitting on an iron rack above the logs, boiling water and bits of dehydrated meat and vegetables. Later I'd add the rice. While it cooked, I explored the clearing behind the house. I found what I thought was the old sycamore tree that Gwyneth had written about and was careful not to walk too close. There was a pile of rocks in front of it which I assumed was a marker. I did not want to step on Agatha's grave. Eventually, I stumbled over another marker, an embankment that I soon realized had once been the border of Agatha's vegetable garden. Somehow her plants had continued to propagate over the years. Squash vines wound into the weeds, and stands of green onion and garlic chives stood strong on their own, fending off the grass. When I pulled some of the weeds near the garlic, the strong smell of herbs filled the air, and I realized that there was still a stand of basil and thyme interspersed with the grass. I found a few stalks, plucked some garlic, and took it back for my stew. That night, by the light of a low fire and candles, I sat in the front room and read more of Gwyneth's diary.
I can hear them out there in the night,
she had written in June of 1958.
They are always near, but especially now at the solstice. They know the book is here. I have never spoken one word of power here, but they remain nearby, waiting. Sometimes at night I hear their footsteps on the roof. I can feel them watching me in the daytime. Agatha called them. She said it got lonely all those years, and sometimes it made her feel better to see their eyes outside in the night. Small orbs of power waiting in the forest, standing by, listening for a word. There is more than one word of power. There is the last word, of course, and we have guarded that word with our lives since the dawn of the written word. There may be a day when the word is needed, but until then, it must never be said. But there are other words, syllables that speak to the primordial, to the creatures that can traverse worlds, those who lived before us and will remain when we are dust. Those words are also in the book we guard, and those are the words Agatha used sometimes. She invoked them for food and comfort. I wonder if those words did her in at the end. The sisterhood swears to never speak the words, even the weakest of them, for the words hold power. The words are power, and we are sworn to protect and assume no power at all. Agatha strayed some, but I will stay true. I will not speak any of the words.
Something creaked above my head. I jumped at the sound, slamming the journal shut. Then I sat rock still and listened. I could hear the beat of my heart, but nothing more, and just as I began to relax, another creak. My eyes stared at the rough-hewn ceiling as if something might jump out of the wood itself. Nothing did. But the creak sounded again, and again. It was travelling across my head, across the roof. I was alone in the forest in an ancient cabin, and something was walking across my roof. There was nobody I could call, and I had no gun. I prayed it wasn't a bear that had smelled my stew cooking or would decide to pour through one of the dry rotted windows to get at it. The sweat began to roll down my ribs. I didn't dare go outside to see what it was. I just prayed it didn't come inside, and then there was another creak at the far end of the roof. Something rattled outside on the ground. I had images of a grizzly casing the joint a few feet and a thin wall away. After a few minutes with no noise, I peered outside. The stars were alive with summer energy above the dark tree line. I couldn't see anything on the porch. I scanned the area between the house and the line of the forest and saw only shifting shadows, grass moving in the wind. Then I looked deeper into the shadow of the tree line, and I saw the eyes. Yellow orbs, dozens of them, watching the cabin, rarely blinking. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I shook my head. Power of suggestion. I whispered to myself, you just read about eyes, so now you're seeing them. They're not eyes. Get real. They are fireflies. I looked outside again and stared at a pair that seemed closer than the rest. They blinked and stared right back. I didn't believe a word I was saying. Fireflies. Sure they were. I didn't sleep well. The creaking didn't repeat itself, but as I lay in bed, I knew the forest was alive with eyes, watching, waiting. When I got up the next morning, I turned the cabin upside down. Gwyneth's diary talked about the book she guarded, but the diary was not the book. She said she had put it in a cupboard in an early post, so I searched those first. Nothing. I emptied the few books stacked on a shelf in the bedroom and searched in the bottoms of every drawer. I moved all of the furniture and even pulled the blackened canned goods off the pantry shelf. I found nothing resembling a book of ancient words. The only books here were a couple of cookbooks and a handful of crumbling paperback novels. Eventually I gave up the search and decided to go for a walk in the woods surrounding the house. That's why I was out here after all, to enjoy the forest, without the endless interruption of texts and emails and calls. Without words. Ironically, a book of words is what I'd wasted half the day searching for, so I walked down to the river and explored the banks looking for tracks. Whatever roamed the forest at night would also roam the edge of the river, right? I slapped away clouds of gnats and jumped at the splash of a couple of fish that leapt out of the water for a second before plunging back in. And there were no tracks. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the shadows of the trees. I turned my head quickly several times, sure that I was going to spot someone or something nearby, but all I saw were the gently waving blades of grass in the summer breeze. Eventually, I returned to the cabin. On a whim, I decided to explore the old garden. I found the herbs again, and started to pull out the unknown weeds and grass that they struggled to rise above. After an hour or so, I was rewarded with a 5-foot swatch of chives and basil and silver sage. I also discovered some squash vines. Now, most didn't have fruit, but I did stumble over one plant that had half a dozen crookneck squash. I picked a couple and stood up to admire my work. I hadn't done much hiking today, but I had tended a herb garden. Somehow I felt accomplished for that. I added the squash and basil to the leftover stew from last night. I kept it in a covered pot near the fire and added water in the morning to keep it from drying out. Now at this point it was largely mush, so the squash would give it some texture. After dinner, I poured myself a drink and sat back to watch the fire. It wasn't long before I drifted to sleep, but not for long. I jerked awake when something above my head creaked. Paused. Creaked again. Steps. On the roof, slow and steady, moving from one side to the other. My eyes shed their drowsiness quickly. Creak, click. Creak, click. Creak. Something moved just a few feet above my head. Slowly I rose from the chair. It was dark outside now, the only light from the low flame above the embers of my fireplace. Crack. I jerked backwards at the sound, knocking over the rest of my glass of bourbon. It rolled off the table and hit the floor with a telltale snap. Broken glass. I didn't care. I was staring at the ceiling, wondering if whatever was on the roof was now inside an Eve. The noise didn't repeat, and I walked slowly to the window to peer outside. Maybe it had jumped off the roof. As I stared out at the old porch, there was nothing but the reflection of the moon on the rotted planks. The tree line was ominous, pitch black and silent. And then something blinked. And again, small points of light. Orange, intelligent light. Soon the tree line was alive with eyes, all of them looking right back at me. I shifted away from the window and bent to pick up the shards of broken glass before I stepped on them, and then I noticed the line of bourbon on the floor. It had fled the ruined glass and ran right up to the old wood panelling behind the small table. I got down on my hands and knees to pick up the glass beneath the table, but then I stopped. There was a latch at the bottom of the panelling, right where the liquid disappeared underneath the board. I traced an almost invisible line that ran in the crease of the panelling. Now that I knew that it was there, I could see where the line cut across the grain, and I crawled backwards, moved the table and chair, and found a second latch that had been hidden. Then I understood why there was a low indentation in the floor, so you could slip a finger beneath the edge to pry it open. There was no knob, which helped keep the door's existence hidden from casual sight. I slid my finger into the indentation and pulled, and the small door, maybe only 2 feet by 2 feet, squeaked outwards. Inside the hidden cabinet was a stack of candles and dolls, and a small black wooden case. I ignored the rest and pulled that out into the light of the room, and opened the lid. Inside, as I had instantly suspected, was a thin book. It looked ancient, weathered and cracked brown leather. I was afraid to open it, but slowly, carefully I did. When I saw the intricately drawn script inside, I forgot all about the eyes in the forest and the creature over my head. This was, without a doubt, the book. The beginning pages were difficult to understand. The letters were drawn like art and the words were archaic English, but old English. They spoke of doorways and powers and gifts and retribution. I wasn't terribly clear on any of it, but I decided to flip forward, and that's when I found the first word. It was written in black block letters accentuated with gold and red ink. The word was large and ornate and all alone in the center of the page. It was 13 letters long. On the borders of all four sides of the page were tiny words written in a thin, almost invisible script. I turned the book slowly around as I struggled to read them. They said, "With a word they will feed you. With a word they will come. With a word they will stop you from being undone." I sounded out the word in my head. It was strange. Not English, though represented in the English alphabet. Did I dare to speak it aloud? I pondered this thought for a moment and then laughed. An whole book of magic words. Seriously. I opened my mouth and said it as best as I could. I waited. The air seemed pregnant with anticipation. Nothing happened. What did I expect? I laughed and then opened my mouth and said it again, this time louder, almost a yell, actually. The house remained still. No explosions of smoke or fairy appearances. I smiled to myself and closed the book. After another swig of bourbon, I looked outside. The forest was dark. I chided myself, imagination running wild. After a bit, I went to bed and almost instantly fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. The demanding rays of a summer sun woke me in the morning. The room was bright with the promise of a gorgeous day, so I sat up, stretched, and then walked through the sitting room. When I opened the front door to let in some air, I almost stepped on my breakfast. There were 4 large white eggs sitting on the rotten wood of the porch. I frowned and looked around the clearing. Nobody was around. Who would have brought me eggs? I bent down and picked one up, rolled it around in my hand. It seemed like a normal chicken egg. Looking around once more and seeing no one, I took the eggs into the kitchen. I cracked them open in a small bowl, and yellow yolks slid out. They were fresh. Shrugging, I stirred them up. They smelled and looked good. I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I was making scrambled eggs for breakfast. After adding wood to the fire and cooking my unexpected breakfast over it, I settled back to look at the book of words again. I read the page from last night once more. With a word they will feed you. With a word they will come. With a word they will stop you from being undone. Had I really received breakfast because of speaking an ancient word? The idea was preposterous, but there was nobody else in the woods from what I could tell. My phone vibrated and I glanced at it, but shook my head. Work. I knew if I answered it, I'd be drawn into some pointless drama, so I thumbed the notification away. I was on vacation, damn it. I would spare no words for work. That afternoon, I walked for a mile or more through the trees and long, undisturbed forest floor and found no evidence of other campers, or hikers, or habitation. When I returned to the cabin, there was a deer laid out on the porch, and a handful of potatoes. Again, the clearing was empty, but there was no question in my mind now that the word had invoked the glowing eyes to feed me. Luckily, there was still a large supply of salt in the cabin's kitchen. It was hard as a rock, but I knew that it would work to brine the venison and keep me in meat for a few days. Refusing to think of the why, I dragged the deer out back and got the sharpest knife I could find from the kitchen. I didn't have the means to properly preserve all of the meat, but I could preserve a good bit of it in large pots of brine, till I could fashion some kind of smokehouse. That night I ate fresh wood-fired cooked venison and baked potatoes with spinach and mushrooms I found growing up back near the garden and tree line. Gourmet camping. I pulled out Gwyneth's journal and read more.
Agatha's influence remains long after her death. They feed me and comfort me in the night. I remain cautious of their influence, however. They are not human. They are not even lost souls. They are something else. They have no morals. Whatever is wished, I must control my thoughts. The wrong desire could be deadly. But they provide some relief from my lifelong sentence here. Someone must guard the words, and somehow I must eventually find my own successor. The book cannot be discovered by the uninitiated, and it is too valuable to be destroyed. Someday, somebody may have need of it. Agatha considered using it during the World War. I know this from her training so many years ago. And maybe she did. Maybe that's why the tide turned and the carnage ended. I don't know. But someday, we may need the last word of power. I will guard it with my life. All my life.
I closed the diary and pulled out the book. The bits of yellowed paper flaked off every time I turned a page. There were many words inside, each alone in the center of a page with some description written on the four edges around it. But now I was curious. What was the word of power exactly? I skipped the middle and opened the final page of the book. The word was written alone on the page. There was nothing surrounding it in the margins, only the word itself. It was long, seemingly 7 syllables. I raised an eyebrow as I tried to fathom the meaning and pronunciation of its 21 letters. My throat constricted as I considered that women had sat here in this cabin for years, solely to guard this page from being seen by the likes of me. My phone buzzed in my pocket then, and I pulled it out to see another notification from work. I thumbed it away angrily. On vacation, I murmured. Then, on a hunch, I pulled up Google and searched for the word. The website turned white for a moment and then refreshed. No results. Did you mean? Google offered a completely different word. No, I said out loud. I meant, and without thinking, I spoke the word that I'd been pronouncing in my head. Someone thumping hard on the roof. The scramble of feet moved above my head and disappeared over the other side. My heart jumped, but just as it did, my phone buzzed again in my hand. I looked down. Another text from work. Oh my God, I whispered. Wish the world would just go away and leave me alone already. Something slammed at the window, and I saw a pair of yellow eyes staring in. Close. Not out in the forest. I jumped up, but the eyes vanished as soon as I moved. I approached the window and looked out. The forest was black. I walked out into the clearing and peered at the roof. I could see nothing up there. Shrugging, I returned to the cabin. The next morning, there were no eggs on my porch. I had to admit slight disappointment, but you couldn't expect magical creatures to feed you breakfast every day. I focused on the practical, and with some basic tools from the cabin, I pulled apart the remains of the outhouse out back, added some logs, and refashioned the wood as a smokehouse. I dug a pit and lined it with rock, and then doused the wood with river water. Then, I hung some of my brined venison from a metal rod I'd found in the cabin's storage closet, and built a fire beneath it. My phone did not go off that day, or the next. I let the battery die. It was blissful, and the smoked meat was plentiful and amazing. Several times I silently thanked whatever powers had brought the deer, but the eyes did not reappear. I read more of Gwyneth's journal and studied some of the book's other words of power. She had apparently gotten ill, and towards the end, wrote that she must ask Agatha's friends for help, for she felt at her end. There were no more entries. What had she asked? What had they done for her? I charged my phone from a battery and decided I should probably check in with Amy, but I got no response. There seemed to be a cell signal, but my text went unanswered, and when I checked my Facebook page, there had been no activity from anyone all week. After a couple more days of complete silence, I got worried, and decided that my solitude had reached its natural end. I had eaten all the venison I dared, the bourbon was gone, so I packed my backpack and closed the door to the cabin after ensuring the fire was completely out in the hearth. You were just what I needed, I said to the silent structure, and then I began the trek back up the hillside to find the trail back to my car. Only as I left the clearing and began to walk through the woods, the trees seemed to thin out. I don't mean that there were fewer trees, just the trees grew insubstantial. With every step, the woods in front of me faded. It was as if everything turned to fog, and after a few more steps, I reached out to touch one of the hazy trees, and my hand passed right through the 3-foot-wide trunk. What the hell? I hurried forward, but found that I couldn't go too much farther, because the world in front of me soon stretched out in an endless cloud of empty white. I walked forward a bit, but when I turned and could barely see the trees behind me, I headed back. I did not want to lose my way in the nothingness. My heart grew cold with the realization of what I had done. I had spoken the last word of power. I had wished the world away, and it had gone. My wish granted. The forest eyes eventually came back when I used the word. They feed me. Perhaps they kept me from being undone, as the book promised. They are not of this world, I realize, and so they remain, but no matter how many times I say the last word and wish for the world to return, the emptiness beyond the cabin remains unfilled. And so I write this at the end of Gwyneth's journal in case somehow, someday, the world returns and finds me gone, but this book remaining. I only hope that this is what will happen. Words can have power, sometimes far too much power. I pray that there is someone left to read these words I leave behind and heed my warning. Be careful of the words you choose to say. Words can be more powerful than you might imagine. Especially the last word.
That was John Everson's The Last Word, as read by the dynamic duo of Alasdair Stuart and Marguerite Kennett, co-owners of the Escape Artists family of podcasts, which includes one of our all-time favorites, Pseudopod. Alasdair Stuart is a professional enthusiast, pop culture analyst, writer, and voice actor. He co-owns the Escape Artists podcasts and hosts their weekly horror fiction show, Pseudopod. Alasdair is an Audioverse Award winner, a multiple Hugo and BFA finalist, writes the award-nominated weekly pop culture newsletter, The Full Lid, and blogs, streams, and tweets. Marguerite is a California transplant living in the UK. She co-runs Escape Artists, the media production company behind original, award-winning free weekly audio fiction. A practicing technology lawyer, Marguerite loves doing voice work for podcasts, community organizing, and teaching business skills to creatives. Links to all of their respective socials and websites are in the show notes. Thank you so much, Alasdair and Marguerite, for helping us celebrate this milestone. And thank you, Children of the Night, for getting us to this place, for making 500 or 499 possible. We literally would not be here without you, without the support of our listeners and our fans. Well, Children of the Night, the hour is late, and we've run out of tales to tell. For now. Tales to Terrify is made possible by the tremendous generosity of our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. Amazing fans like Kathy Robinson, aka Deadly Blonde. If you're not a supporter already, be like Kathy. Head over to patreon.com/Tales to Terrify, where you'll find all kinds of perks, from ad-free episodes and bonus content to shoutouts and merch packs. Every dollar goes back into the show to help make it as dark and devious as possible. And we appreciate it so much. Want another way to support the show that doesn't cost a cent? Head over to Stitcher, Podchaser, or Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You'll not only put an unnaturally wide smile on our faces, but help new listeners discover our terrifying tales too. Now you can share your love of the show out in the world with some Tales to Terrify merch. TalesToTerrify.com/merch will take you to our TeePublic store, where we've got a great collection of creepy custom and curated designs that's always growing, so check back often. Tales to Terrify is produced by Seth Williams, Pete Morcellino, Meredith Morgenstern, Brian Rollins, and myself, Drew Sebastini, with original theme by Nebulous Entertainment. Tales to Terrify is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Join us again next week for the terrifying sequel with more Tales to Terrify.